The night was calm, but the sea was not silent. Beneath the rolling surface of the western Pacific, a shadow moved, slow, deliberate, and unseen. Above, the Japanese battleship Musashi carved through the moonlit water, a floating fortress of steel and firepower. Her engines throbbed like the heartbeat of an empire, her decks lined with men who believed they were untouchable. Every rivet, every gun, every beam of searchlight spoke of power. The old kind, built on armor and fear. But hundreds of feet below, another kind of power stirred. Inside a steel tube barely long enough to stretch one's arms, a handful of American submariners whispered commands in the red glow of their instruments. Their target loomed vast above, a mountain of metal they could never match in size, only in cunning. A click, a hiss. The torpedo left its tube, slicing upward into darkness. Seconds stretched into eternity. Then, a distant flash, a tremor through the sea, and the great battleship shuddered. Japan was about to learn that even giants can drown. Before the war began, the Imperial Japanese Navy was a force built on pride and on giants. For decades, Japan's admirals had worshipped the doctrine of the battleship, the belief that wars at sea would be decided by colossal guns, armored decks, and line-of-battle engagements worthy of naval legend. They looked to Tsushima, 1905, when Japan's battleships had annihilated the Russian fleet. That victory had carved an idea deep into Japan's military mind, that sea power belonged to those who could build the biggest ships, the thickest armor, and the longest guns. By the late 1930s, that belief had become almost sacred. The Yamato-class battleships, secret symbols of national pride, were constructed in enormous dockyards under strict secrecy. Each one was a floating citadel, over 70,000 tons of armor and artillery, bristling with 18-inch guns capable of hurling a shell the size of a car more than 20 miles. To the Japanese high command, they were invincible guardians of the Pacific Empire. This confidence fed Japan's entire maritime strategy. The empire stretched from Manchuria to the islands of the South Pacific, connected by fragile lines of oil, rubber, and steel. The Navy's mission was to defend these arteries, ensuring the lifeblood of conquest could flow. Japan's officers believed that if they could destroy America's battle fleet in a single decisive engagement, a second Tsushima, the Pacific would belong to them for generations. It was a mindset both majestic and fatal. While Japan poured resources into its great ships, the United States quietly studied a different kind of power. The U.S. Navy understood that modern war was changing, that aircraft and submarines were eroding the age of battleships. Yet before 1941, this shift was still theoretical. No one had yet proven that small, stealthy craft could threaten the giants of the sea. When Japan struck Pearl Harbor in December 1941, that doctrine of invincibility seemed vindicated. Battleships burned in the harbor. The Pacific Fleet was crippled. Japan's empire expanded almost overnight. The Philippines, Singapore, the Dutch East Indies. Its admirals believed they had achieved what they were born to do: command the ocean. But in the shadows beneath that triumph, the seeds of Japan's undoing were already stirring. For every Yamato that launched, for every carrier that soared into the Pacific, the United States was building something far smaller and infinitely more patient. These were submarines, hidden predators that Japan's admirals dismissed as little more than reconnaissance tools. Their fleet was designed for decisive battles, not for invisible hunters. Japan's anti-submarine warfare capabilities were primitive. Limited sonar, inadequate depth charges, poor coordination. The Imperial Navy had never faced a sustained underwater threat. In those early years, it didn't matter. The Pacific seemed endless, and Japan's power unshakable. Its convoys moved freely across the vast empire, carrying oil from Borneo, rubber from Malaya, and ore from the Philippines. the lifeblood that kept its war machine running. But the ocean remembers everything, and far below its surface, the balance of power was already shifting. As the war dragged on, the U.S. Navy would discover that its most powerful weapon wasn't the aircraft carrier or the battleship, but the silent hunter that could wait weeks for a single shot. The stage was set for a new kind of warfare, one where patience, mathematics, and stealth could drown an empire. The myth of invincibility was about to meet the reality of the deep. The early American submarine force was anything but perfect. In 1942, when U.S. submarines first began to prowl the Pacific, they were armed with faulty weapons, outdated doctrine, and limited experience. The Navy's pride, the Mark 14 torpedo, was an engineering disaster disguised as progress. It ran too deep. It detonated too early, or not at all. For months, American submariners watched in disbelief as perfect firing solutions failed one after another. Torpedoes struck hulls and bounced off, exploded prematurely, or sailed harmlessly beneath their targets. Reports were met with disbelief at headquarters, until evidence piled too high to ignore. Commander Charles Lockwood, later commander of the Pacific Submarine Fleet, would remember his frustration vividly. "If the Bureau of Ordnance were out here, we'd sink them with our defective torpedoes." At first, U.S. submarines were assigned defensive patrols, reconnaissance, lifeguard duty, scouting enemy movements. Their commanders were bound by peacetime caution and hesitant tactics. But as the war deepened, so did their purpose. The Pacific Ocean, vast beyond comprehension, was Japan's greatest strength, and soon its greatest vulnerability. Every drop of oil, every ton of coal, every sack of rice that fed its soldiers and factories had to travel by sea. Japan's empire was connected by nothing but ocean lanes, invisible highways through danger. Once America realized this, the war beneath the waves changed completely. The new strategy was simple, brutal, and revolutionary. Cut Japan's supply lines, starve its war machine, turn the empire's greatest strength, the ocean, into its trap. But to do that, the United States had to fix its fleet. By mid-1943, engineers had solved the Mark 14's problems. Submarines were retrofitted, tactics rewritten, and a new generation of aggressive commanders took the helm. Men like Mush Morton of the USS Wahoo and Dudley "Mush" O'Kane of the USS Tang. They hunted not by routine, but by instinct. Their boats became ghosts, silent, patient, and deadly. The submarine's periscope became the eye of retribution, rising like a blade above the waves. Crews learned to track convoys by sonar, to attack at night, to vanish before the enemy could even locate them. By 1944, the American submarine force had matured into one of the most efficient killers in military history. Barely 2% of the U.S. Navy's personnel served in submarines, yet they would go on to sink over 60% of Japan's merchant fleet and nearly 30% of its warships. To Japan, this transformation was almost invisible. Their admirals still saw submarines as tools of reconnaissance, not annihilation. Anti-submarine warfare, radar, sonar nets, escort destroyers, remained primitive. Convoys were few, scattered, and poorly protected. The result was devastating. Japanese tankers and freighters began vanishing from the sea lanes. The empire's fuel supplies dwindled, then collapsed. By 1945, even mighty ships like the Yamato could barely leave port for lack of fuel. But behind that strategic shift lay something more personal. A revolution in how war was fought. The U.S. Navy had learned that technology alone was not enough. It was adaptation, intelligence, and the courage to learn from failure that turned its submarines from flawed prototypes into perfect hunters. The silent service, once dismissed and overlooked, had become the sharpest blade in America's arsenal. From the depths of frustration and failure rose a force that would change naval warfare forever, and drag Japan's war machine, piece by piece, to the bottom of the Pacific. The age of battleships was ending. The era of invisible killers had begun. Life aboard a U.S. submarine was a strange mix of monotony, fear, and steel resolve. The boats were small, barely long enough for a man to walk without brushing his shoulders against pipes or valves. The air was thick with diesel fumes and sweat, a permanent haze of oil and machinery. It's up to you. Every man aboard knew that one wrong sound, one wrong depth setting, could turn their vessel into a tomb. Yet morale was astonishingly high. The submariners were handpicked, the quiet professionals of the Navy. They called their boats pig boats, and themselves the silent service. They slept in narrow bunks wedged beside torpedoes. They ate canned food that tasted of rust. Every dive pressed their ears until it felt like the ocean itself was crushing their skulls. But they endured, not for glory, but for each other. When the order came, "Dive! Dive!" every man moved without hesitation. In that moment, the submarine became one body, every heartbeat synchronized in silence. Above them, depth charges fell like hammers, echoing through the steel hull. Each explosion meant death might be seconds away. And yet, they stayed. Because their war was not fought in headlines or parades, it was fought in whispers, in patience, and in shadows. The Pacific was vast, too vast for brute force. The submarine's success depended on cunning, timing, and mathematics. Early in the war, American boats hunted alone, striking isolated targets. But as the campaign deepened, new doctrines emerged. The U.S. Navy borrowed from the German playbook, wolfpack tactics, small coordinated groups of submarines working together to trap convoys. Submarines began patrolling in choke points: the Luzon Strait, the South China Sea, the waters off Formosa. They learned to attack not at random, but with purpose, targeting tankers, transports, and supply lines instead of isolated warships. Each torpedo that hit a fuel tanker carried more impact than sinking a cruiser. Japan's convoy system was chaotic. Merchant ships often sailed unescorted, or with minimal destroyer protection. Radar was rare, and sonar technology lagged far behind the Allies. This left vast gaps in their defenses, open hunting grounds for American boats. Submarines learned to wait in silence for hours, sometimes days, tracking a convoy's course by faint propeller sounds. When the moment came, the captain would whisper the command, "Fire 1, Fire 2. Within seconds, chaos erupted on the surface. Fire, confusion, searchlights cutting through smoke, and before the enemy could respond, the submarine was gone, slipping beneath the waves like a ghost. Tactics evolved as losses mounted. American boats began using radar for surface tracking, approaching at night with precision once thought impossible. The ocean was no longer Japan's safe empire. It had become an ambush zone, every horizon potentially deadly. Technology turned the tide beneath the sea. At the start of the war, the U.S. submarine fleet lagged behind in both design and weaponry. But by 1943, that changed dramatically. The Mark 14 torpedo, once unreliable, was redesigned and recalibrated. Depth control issues were fixed, and magnetic detonators were refined. The new Mark 18 electric torpedo arrived soon after, leaving no telltale wake for the enemy to see. Submarine hulls were reinforced for deeper dives. The Gato class and Balao class became the backbone of the fleet, strong, fast, and capable of crossing the Pacific without refueling. Then came radar and sonar integration. Surface search radar allowed submarines to detect convoys at night, long before they were spotted. Sonar, or ASDIC, became the ear beneath the ocean, able to trace ships by sound alone. The periscope, once a simple optical tool, evolved into a precision instrument. Captains could calculate bearing, speed, and distance in seconds. It turned the vast, blind ocean into a battlefield of geometry and instinct. Every improvement narrowed the odds, giving submariners the confidence to strike deeper into enemy waters. Technology didn't make them fearless. It made their fear useful. It gave form to their patience and purpose, to their silence. The result was not just a weapon, but a new kind of warfare. Invisible, intelligent, and relentless. And for Japan, that silence was about to become terrifyingly loud. By 1944, Japan's admirals faced an invisible enemy they couldn't understand. Their convoys vanished without warning. Ships left port and never arrived. Entire squadrons disappeared in calm seas, leaving only oil slicks and floating debris. The terror was not in what they saw, but in what they couldn't. American submarines turned the Pacific into a psychological battlefield. A single periscope sighting could send an entire fleet scattering. Merchant captains sailed in silence, forbidden to use radios. Crews began sleeping in their life jackets, knowing that death could rise from below at any moment. This fear reshaped Japanese morale. Superstitions spread. Sailors whispered about phantom torpedoes and ghost boats. The ocean, once the proud domain of the Imperial Navy, became an enemy itself. Every ripple, every shadow felt like a threat. The deception was total. Submarines sometimes attacked in one area, then surfaced miles away to transmit false signals, convincing Japanese intelligence that entire wolf packs were operating where there were none. Convoys were rerouted in panic, spreading their defenses thin. The result was paralysis by fear. Japan's admirals, once masters of sea power, now found themselves reacting to illusions, to ghosts that didn't exist until they struck. For every ship sunk, 3 more were delayed or diverted. The psychological impact far outweighed the physical losses, and by the time Japan realized it, the illusion had become reality. The ocean was no longer theirs to command. Beneath the calm discipline of the submariners lay a far greater engine, America's industry. The United States didn't just fight the war, it manufactured victory. While Japan struggled to replace a single lost destroyer, American shipyards were launching new submarines every month. Electric Boat Company, Portsmouth, and Mare Island became the beating heart of the silent service. Assembly lines churned out hulls faster than Japan could sink them. Each new class, Gato, Balao, Tench, improved on the last, adding range, endurance, and comfort for the men aboard. Crews trained relentlessly, rotating from one patrol to the next with precision and speed. Meanwhile, back home, American factories supplied endless engines, batteries, torpedoes, and sonar equipment. The industrial scale was staggering. What Japan saw as technological sorcery was simply mass production at a scale the world had never seen. This disparity was Japan's undoing. The empire's industrial base, already stretched thin, could not match losses. Each sunken tanker meant fuel shortages. Each destroyed freighter meant fewer materials reaching the front. By 1945, Japan's economy was collapsing from within, not by bombing raids, but by starvation of resources. The submarine campaign didn't just sink ships. It strangled an empire, and the irony was cruel. Japan had started the war by attacking America's fleet at Pearl Harbor, but it was America's smallest fleet, its invisible one, that would finish it. For the Japanese Navy, the realization came too late. In 1942, they dismissed American submarines as inefficient, uncoordinated, and cowardly, hiding instead of fighting. By 1944, those same submarines were tearing the empire apart from below. Japanese naval reports grew desperate. Commanders described waves of unseen attackers and torpedo storms in areas believed safe. Convoy routes were shortened, ship numbers reduced, and naval escorts spread thin. The Imperial Navy's anti-submarine warfare was woefully outdated. Sonar sets were crude. Depth charges lacked range and accuracy. Aircraft patrols were rare due to fuel shortages. In many cases, the only defense was prayer. Even the great admirals, Yamamoto, Ugaki, Toyoda, recognized the futility too late. Their focus on battleships and carrier warfare had blinded them to a quieter threat. The Empire's war machine depended on fuel from Borneo, rubber from Malaya, and iron from China, all of which traveled through waters now haunted by American submarines. By 1945, Japan's shipping losses reached catastrophic levels, over 8 million tons of merchant shipping destroyed. Some submarines, like the USS Tang and USS Barb, sank entire convoys single-handedly. Others laid mines off Japan's coast, cutting even home waters off from safety. Japanese morale fractured. Captains refused to sail. Shipyards ran dry. Civilians in Tokyo and Osaka felt the famine firsthand, because the sea lanes that once fed the empire were gone. When surrender finally came, Japan's admirals admitted an unthinkable truth. They had been defeated not by aircraft or battleships, but by shadows, by small boats, silent and unseen, that had turned the Pacific into a graveyard of steel. The turning point came not with a single torpedo, but with a series of silent strikes that shattered Japan's confidence in the sea. The empire that had once ruled the Pacific began to realize that even its largest, proudest ships could die in the dark. It began with June 19, 1944, the Battle of the Philippine Sea. While American carrier pilots fought Japan's last great air armada above, a new kind of hunter stalked below. Submarines such as the USS Albacore and USS Kavala waited like silent witnesses beneath the waves, their periscopes barely breaking the surface. When Japan's massive new carrier Taiho, the pride of the Imperial Navy, launched its aircraft into the sky that morning, her crew believed she was untouchable. She was Japan's first armored carrier, designed to survive what had sunk others at Midway. But she never saw her killer. At 8:10 a.m., the USS Albacore fired 6 torpedoes from long range. One found its mark. The explosion was small, at first. Taiho kept sailing, her flight deck still launching planes. Yet inside, aviation fuel fumes spread silently through the ship. An hour later, a spark, perhaps from a switch, perhaps from a careless act, ignited the fumes. The explosion ripped through her hangars like a storm. Within minutes, the massive carrier was engulfed in fire. By afternoon, she rolled, capsized, and vanished beneath the sea. More than 1,600 men went down with her. The impregnable symbol of Japan's naval pride was gone, felled by one torpedo from a submarine that never even surfaced. The same day, the USS Kavala found another target, the carrier Shokaku, veteran of Pearl Harbor and Coral Sea. 3 torpedoes struck home. She too went down in flames, taking hundreds of sailors with her. It was the death of an era. In a single day, Japan lost 2 of its most important carriers. Not to aircraft or surface guns, but to unseen hunters below. From that point forward, Japanese admirals knew the truth they had long denied. The ocean that once protected them now belonged to the enemy. The success of those submarines sent ripples far beyond the battlefield. American submarine captains became the quiet legends of the Pacific. Men like Commander Dick O'Kane of the Tang, Mush Morton of the Wahoo, and Eugene Fluckey of the Barb. They operated alone, hundreds of miles behind enemy lines, striking with surgical precision and vanishing without trace. Their victories were not just tactical, they were psychological ruptures. Every sinking eroded Japan's illusion of control. Every explosion beneath the sea was a reminder that the empire's lifeblood, oil, iron, food, flowed through a gauntlet of invisible death. But the most shocking blow came months later. On November 29, 1944, the USS Archerfish detected a massive contact off the coast of Japan. The target was enormous, moving slowly, almost too large for a single submarine to handle. It was the Shinano, the largest aircraft carrier ever built, converted from a Yamato-class battleship. So secret was her construction that even most Japanese sailors didn't know she existed. She was supposed to be untouchable, a floating fortress carrying planes, ammunition, and repair facilities. But that night, she sailed with no air cover, no escort screen, and a crew barely trained for combat. The Archerfish tracked her for 6 hours, crawling into position under cover of darkness. At 3:17 a.m., Commander Joseph Enright gave the order. Fire 1, Fire 2, Fire 3, Fire 4. 4 torpedoes struck in perfect sequence. The great carrier began to list immediately. Within 7 hours, the Shinano, 72,000 tons of steel, capsized and sank, taking over 1,400 men with her. She had been at sea for less than 24 hours. The sinking of Shinano was more than a naval disaster. It was a revelation. For the first time, Japan realized that no ship, no matter how large, could hide from what hunted beneath. The ocean, once a symbol of imperial pride, had turned traitor. And from its depths, the silent killers rose, rewriting the rules of modern warfare, proving that in the Pacific, size no longer meant survival. The sinking of Shinano marked a breaking point, not just in Japan's fleet, but in its national psyche. In Tokyo, naval officials were stunned into silence. The ship had barely been completed, her existence known to only a handful of top commanders. Yet somehow, the Americans had found her and destroyed her before she even fired a single shot. The question burned through Japan's naval ministry. How? How had a single submarine slipped through their home waters, the same waters they believed impregnable, and struck so deep? The answer lay in a quiet transformation that Japan never saw coming. By late 1944, the U.S. Navy's submarine force had mastered a new kind of war, one of precision, patience, and persistence. The early years of failure had been replaced by ruthless efficiency. Radar and sonar guided them through the dark. New torpedoes, redesigned after years of frustration, finally ran true. And above all, experience had forged their crews into elite hunters. While Japan poured its dwindling resources into massive ships it could no longer protect, the United States had built a fleet of ghosts, hundreds of submarines that moved unseen, carrying destruction to every corner of the Pacific. The effects were devastating. Every Japanese ship that sank was not just a tactical loss. It was a logistical wound. Tankers carrying oil from the Dutch East Indies vanished. Freighters hauling rice, rubber, and iron ore were ripped apart by torpedoes. Convoys traveling from Borneo to Japan dwindled in number until, by 1945, almost 90% of Japan's merchant fleet was gone. Without oil, Japan's planes could not fly. Without steel, its factories could not produce. Even the great battleships that remained, the Yamato, the Nagato, the Musashi, were trapped in port, unable to sail for lack of fuel. The empire that had once spanned from Burma to the Solomons began to collapse from within. By early 1945, starvation stalked Japan's cities. Blackouts and shortages became the norm. Trains slowed, ships stopped, and the once proud navy that had terrorized Asia was now afraid to leave its own harbors. The submarines had done what no armada could. They had cut the veins of an empire. In the shadows of this unseen war, the numbers told their own grim story. U.S. submarines, only about 2% of the Navy's personnel, sank more than 300 Japanese merchant ships and over 200 warships. They destroyed nearly 55% of Japan's total maritime tonnage. But these victories came at a cost. 52 American submarines never returned. Nearly 3,500 submariners, 1 in 5, were lost to the deep. They died as silently as they fought, their names preserved only in the steel plaques of memorial walls and the pages of after-action reports. Their sacrifice, though largely unseen, had reshaped the Pacific War. For Japan, the realization was agonizing. The Imperial Navy had been built on the doctrine of decisive surface battles, vast fleets clashing in daylight. But that doctrine belonged to another age. The war had moved below the surface, into a realm of invisibility and endurance. Even as the Allied air raids began to flatten Japanese cities, the deeper wound was already bleeding. The collapse of supply, of mobility, of hope. Japan's admirals, once the masters of the Pacific, now faced an impossible truth. They had lost not in grand battle, but in silence. When the war finally ended in August 1945, the remnants of Japan's fleet lay rusting in harbors, unable to move. The sea that had once been their empire's highway had become its grave. From Pearl Harbor to the sinking of Shinano, the arc of Japan's naval power had come full circle. From dominance born in surprise to defeat delivered in silence. And somewhere beneath those same waters, American submarines cruised homeward through the night, their decks slick with salt spray, their men exhausted but alive. They had no fanfare, no parades, only the quiet understanding that their war had been won not with glory, but with persistence. One torpedo, one convoy, one unseen strike at a time. The Pacific had been conquered not by the biggest guns or the strongest ships, but by the smallest vessels, driven by men who never saw the sunlight for weeks, who lived in the hum of engines and the scent of oil and steel. They had rewritten naval warfare forever, and in doing so, they had taught a proud empire a lesson it would never forget. Even giants can drown. By the beginning of 1945, the Pacific had turned into a graveyard. Every shipping lane that once fed Japan's empire was now haunted by unseen predators. The Imperial Navy's proud battleships, once symbols of power, were useless without fuel. Its island garrisons, from Rabaul to the Marianas, starved in isolation, and its merchant fleet, the lifeline of an island nation, had been reduced to wrecks scattered across the seabed. The statistics told a brutal story. Between 1943 and 1945, U.S. submarines sank over 4.8 million tons of Japanese merchant shipping, a rate that no industrial nation could endure. In the first months of 1942, Japan had launched over 1,000 merchant vessels. By mid-1945, fewer than 100 remained operational. Entire convoys vanished without a trace, and replacement ships could not be built fast enough to fill the void. Each patrol became more lethal than the last. By 1944, U.S. submarines were sinking ships at a rate of nearly one every day. Crews that had once returned empty-handed in 1942 now came back with full logs of kills. They had mastered their craft, using radar to track convoys at night, sonar to evade escorts, and new acoustic torpedoes that could home in on propeller sounds. The Japanese response, however, remained painfully inadequate. Convoy systems were introduced late and inconsistently. Escort vessels were few, hastily built, and poorly equipped with sonar or depth charges. Aircraft coverage was unreliable, and the few surviving destroyers were pulled between convoy duty and fleet protection, doing neither effectively. The Imperial Navy tried to develop countermeasures, improved detection equipment, new tactics, and escort groups modeled after the Allies. But they lacked the industrial base to produce the ships, the training to use them, and the fuel to deploy them. It was a defense built on desperation. Meanwhile, American submarines grew bolder. Operating in coordinated wolf packs, they hunted not just lone targets, but entire convoys. Commanders like Dudley "Mush" Morton of USS Wahoo, Eugene Fluckey of USS Barb, and Richard O'Kane of USS Tang became legends, their submarines striking deep into Japanese home waters, even surfacing at night to shell harbors and trains. Japan's defensive perimeter shrank daily. By 1944, merchant routes through the South China Sea and Philippine waters were death traps. Tankers carrying oil from Borneo and the Dutch East Indies stopped sailing altogether. Without those tankers, Japan's war effort began to suffocate. In Tokyo, the High Command scrambled for alternatives: synthetic fuel production, rationing, even plans to convert civilian vessels into emergency transports. But nothing could replace the tonnage lost beneath the waves. Factories slowed, air bases ran dry, and entire armies were stranded across Asia without supplies. The Imperial Navy attempted to reorganize its shrinking escort fleet under the new Kaiboken program. Small, mass-producible anti-submarine escorts, yet these ships were underarmed, underpowered, and arrived far too late. By the time they entered service, the Americans had already perfected radar-guided submarine attacks. Wartime reports from captured Japanese officers revealed a tone of resignation. One post-war analysis by the U.S. Navy summarized it simply: the Japanese merchant fleet was annihilated. The sea, once their greatest strength, became their most merciless enemy. Even as Japan's armies continued to fight across the Pacific Islands, the outcome had already been decided beneath the ocean's surface. The great surface battles, Coral Sea, Midway, Leyte Gulf, had made headlines, but it was the quiet, relentless work of the submariners that sealed Japan's fate. Every torpedo that struck a freighter or tanker was not just a victory at sea, it was another blow to Japan's factories, soldiers, and civilians. By late 1944, Japan's fuel reserves had fallen to less than 10% of pre-war levels. The Air Force could barely train pilots. Battleships like Yamato and Nagato sat immobile in harbors, their massive guns silenced by a lack of oil. The submarines had done their work, quietly, efficiently, completely. The Pacific, once ruled by Japan's steel giants, now belonged to the small, unseen hunters that had learned how to turn the ocean itself into a weapon. And as the empire's supply lines collapsed, a new reality began to take hold, one that would decide not just battles, but the war itself. Because Japan was no longer being defeated on the surface, it was being strangled from below. By early 1945, the war in the Pacific was no longer about territory. It was about survival. Japan's empire still stretched across thousands of miles, but it was hollowed out from within. The invisible blockade beneath the sea had done what no bombing raid or surface fleet ever could. It had starved an entire nation of the means to wage war. The full scale of the submarine campaign's impact became clear only in retrospect. Out of Japan's pre-war merchant fleet of 6 million tons, less than 1/10 survived by the time of surrender. Nearly every tanker capable of carrying oil from Southeast Asia had been sunk. Even fishing boats, small ferries, and coastal transports were pressed into military use and destroyed in turn. The submarine offensive, once a struggling experiment, had evolved into the most efficient destruction machine of the Pacific War. By 1945, only 2% of the U.S. Navy's total manpower served in submarines, yet they accounted for over 55% of all Japanese shipping sunk. It was a victory built on innovation, adaptation, and grim determination. American submarines operated under constant threat, hunted by destroyers, starved of air and light, and forced to endure months in the suffocating silence of steel tubes. But they also developed a rhythm. a system of rotating patrol zones, intelligence sharing, and aggressive leadership that made them unstoppable. The results rippled through every part of Japan's war effort. Factories ran out of raw materials. The great arsenals of Yokosuka and Kure slowed to a crawl. Coal shortages dimmed Tokyo's lights. Rice and food imports from Korea and China fell by 80%. Entire civilian populations faced famine. Even the Imperial Navy, once the most feared in Asia, became a shadow of itself. Its remaining ships, unable to refuel, were trapped in port or used as floating anti-aircraft platforms. The mighty Yamato, once the pride of the fleet, would make its final voyage on a one-way suicide mission. A desperate act born from the very shortages the submarines had created. In essence, America's undersea fleet had waged a war of attrition, not against soldiers, but against a nation's arteries. It was economic warfare on an unprecedented scale. Admiral Charles Lockwood, commander of the Pacific Submarine Forces, summarized it best. Our submarines were the most effective weapons we had. They cut the Japanese lifeline and left her to wither on the vine. But this triumph came with a heavy price. Out of the 288 submarines deployed in the Pacific, 52 were lost, a casualty rate of nearly 1 in 5. More than 3,500 submariners never returned home. Their graves were the ocean floors, unmarked, silent, eternal. The Japanese, too, paid in ways that went beyond numbers. Their overconfidence in surface warfare, the faith in battleships and carrier power, blinded them to the unseen danger below. By the time they realized the true scale of the submarine threat, it was already too late to respond. Their shipyards lay in ruins, their tankers gone, their empire cut off. When Japan finally surrendered in August 1945, the ocean around its islands was eerily quiet. No convoys came home. No freighters left port. The waters that had once carried rice, oil, and soldiers now carried only silence. Post-war analyses would call it the most decisive maritime campaign in history. Not because of its drama or its battles, but because it had quietly destroyed the foundation of Japan's war machine. The submarine blockade had proven a new kind of warfare, one that didn't rely on occupying land or seizing ports, but on strangling an enemy's ability to fight at all. A campaign fought not for glory, but for inevitability. And as the last submarines surfaced in Tokyo Bay after the surrender, their crews saw what they had truly accomplished. Not the defeat of a navy, but the collapse of an empire. The war beneath the waves was over. But it had rewritten the very rules of naval warfare forever. War has always been measured in size, in the weight of guns, the tonnage of armor, the reach of empires. But in the vastness of the Pacific, that measure began to fail. For here, victory did not belong to the largest ships or the loudest cannons. It belonged to the quiet ones, the hunters who fought unseen, beneath the waves. The story of America's submarines is a study in paradox. Tiny machines of war, crewed by fewer than 100 men each, achieved what entire fleets could not. They never sought headlines or glory. There were no cheering crowds when they returned to port, only refueling hoses and new patrol orders. Yet every mission they sailed changed the shape of the war above them. Their victories were invisible. No burning skyline, no captured city. Just vanished ships and empty horizons. But behind that quiet work lay a transformation in warfare itself. Submarines turned the ocean from a highway of commerce into a battlefield of fear. They proved that technology, patience, and precision could undo centuries of naval tradition built on size and spectacle. And in doing so, they reshaped the balance between man and machine. The submariner's courage was not the shout of the charge, but the calm acceptance of the deep. Knowing one wrong move meant a cold, airless grave. Their silence became their strength, their invisibility, their weapon. When the war ended, the great battleships rusted in harbor, relics of another age. But the submarines, the smallest hunters in the Pacific, had already written their legacy across the sea. They had proven that power no longer needed to be seen to be felt, that the truest victories in war are often the quietest ones, and as the waves closed once more over the wrecks of giants, a single truth remained. In the end, Japan learned, even the mightiest battleships can be brought down by silence.